Hello, everybody. So, welcome to this new series on dynamic antitrust discussion series, where we are going to discuss a number of antitrust matters from a dynamic perspective, where innovation, competition will be discussed. I am more than delighted to welcome for the first session two great experts who are going to tell us more about what to expect for the next 4 years of Biden antitrust and how this new administration will address perhaps these antitrust matters. So together with us, we have Commissioner Noah Joshua Phillips. Very warm welcome, Noah. And we also have William Kovacic. William has been counsel, then commissioner, and then former chairman of the Federal Trade Commission. Is now a professor at George Washington University. So welcome to both. And we are going to discuss a number of topics related to this session on Biden antitrust. I just wanted perhaps to start with you, William, talking about this. I mean, this fantastic time we start with after this presidential campaign where antitrust has been at the center of the political discussion. How can we start a transition? How can we start this new presidential term with antitrust being so important in the current discussion? How do you make this as opposed to precedent new administrations?
There have been a couple of developments that have brought it to the front of the discussion. One has been a continuing development in the world of ideas that has brought forward a new narrative, a new fundamental critique of competition law and policy, very much associated with advocates such as Barry Lynn and the work he's done in the Open Markets Institute. A host of other observers, Lena Khan, recently nominated to join or appears to soon to be nominated to join the Federal Trade Commission. A community that over the past 20 years, but more intensely in the past 5 years, has advocated a fundamental transformation of competition law and policy. So an inventory of ideas that promotes basic change. We've had external economic shocks that have raised questions about the soundness of existing economic policy in a number of realms. And the shocks have had the effect of opening up opportunities for new ideas to press against the system. And the combination of forces has led to a new debate in the Congress, so that the advocates for basic change have a platform on which to advance their ideas, to give prominence to them. So the result is that, in a way that certainly I didn't imagine 5 years ago, the conversation has changed dramatically, and we see appointments in the Biden administration that are not going to effectuate an immediate transformation, but are giving the voices that have advocated basic adjustments in the system, what one commentator calls root and branch reconstruction, are giving them significant policy-making voices to carry this discussion ahead. And that is a remarkable story of change in a breathtakingly short period of time.
Right. That's you opposed the transformationalist, as you just described, to the more traditionalist, and I think that's a very accurate distinction, and very, because this debate is now being formalized and structured about these two polarized dimensions. How do you? Well, it's very hard to predict, of course, but how do you see this evolution in the debate?
I think that the transformationalists are going to succeed in changing the stream of policy. The open question is how much going ahead, but the traditionalists you referred to are those who want to do more with existing tools, probably add more tools, but want to situate competition policy in the microeconomic policy framework that it has inhabited for the better part of the last 4 decades, to maintain the focus on consumer interests, to take into account other interests, but to focus first and foremost on consumer interests with respect to price, quality, and innovation. the transformationalists say that is far too timid a vision. If I had to point to one thing that separates the two groups, the transformationalists want to reposition antitrust to an egalitarian vision that focuses not simply on the well-being of citizens as buyers of goods and services, but as small business owners, as workers in smaller enterprises, as residents of communities that have local ownership and control over business enterprises, all with the aim of ensuring that democracy itself thrives. And the transformationalists say, unless you pledge yourself to that objective, you're missing the whole point of competition law. And the interesting question is going to be how much that vision changes the direction of policy. But I think they've already had an effect. They've already had a significant effect. And I anticipate that it will continue, although I'm skeptical about whether they can realize their broader aims. What is noteworthy is that they've come in a sense, in a way that the traditionalists never anticipated. They never saw this coming. They've been outflanked in a dramatic way.
Definitely. Welcome to you, Noah. I mean, of course, you're best placed in order to see that transition going, and it's very interesting to see from your perspective how you see that transition, and also the change of the competition policy tone, the language, the rhetorics that is taking place. What is your take on this very critical momentum?
Sure, and let me first begin by thanking you, Aurelien, thanking ITI for having me, and the caveat that I have to give, which is my views are just mine, and they don't necessarily represent the views of the commission or my fellow commissioners, and I think has been made clear on the public record. Sometimes there's a wide divergence of views. I think I would start in answering your question by backing up a little from antitrust, by backing up a little from competition, because I think part of what is going on is a broader political conversation that uses the language of antitrust. And I think it does so for a couple of very important reasons. The first reason is that much of the debate that we are having on the left and on the right has to do with a not at all new, fairly traditional, if you will, American distrust of the size and power of large corporations. And that is not, it was absolutely part of the debates in adopting the antitrust laws, but it isn't necessarily or only a quibble with competition. So I think there's a lot of resonance there. The second thing is the language of those debates, right, where monopoly comes less to mean a single seller or a firm with market power of a certain kind, and rather a big company I don't like, or a big company that is doing things that I don't like. They're a monopoly. Right? Twitter is engaging in content moderation I don't like. Monopoly. Monopoly is a word that we all learn when we are young. We learn about it in terms of price and a popular board game. But it's a very good way to speak about the suspicion of the power of large corporations. And then, of course, antitrust law and enforcement practice over the centuries, or at least 1 century plus quite a bit, includes a remedy that I think is very appealing from a popular perspective: breakup. People talk about breakup less as solving a market problem these days, and more about some sort of corporate death penalty. It's like the worst thing you can do to a company. People don't get as excited when you say they're wrongdoers, fine them, right? They're wrongdoers, tax them. They're wrongdoers, submit them to a non-discrimination regime or whatever. But breakup, right? People love to say it as this expression of the worst thing you can do, as if, by the way, it stops whatever the conduct is. And one of the most interesting things that strikes me in this debate is if you think about antitrust at all, in terms of output, right? In terms of what the trusts were up to and what the problems with trusts were, where people complain about a business conduct, then they look at a remedy, the purpose of which is to create more of the thing. Mm-hmm. And there is an irony that underlies it. So I do think a lot of this has to do with a broader political debate. I'll just finish by pointing to the fact that some of what Bill was describing, democracy, labor rights, and so forth, is, to my mind, in substantial part, outside the ambit of antitrust, it's not really about competition. Sometimes these issues will be about competition, right? Labor monopsony is a real issue. Agencies are looking at it. But a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is outside. And I'm very, very, very pessimistic about the capability of antitrust to fulfill all of the promise that many advocates have placed in it.
Yeah, that's great, and that's exactly the language that we see. We see, as you just rightly pointed out, we see a language of antitrust in order to address a number of political problems of democracy, and that's right. That perhaps the economics analysis, the perspective, might be less important because we may use, as you just rightly said, use words like monopoly not in an economic term, but more in a political term to describe big corporations. Let's go back to a broader question of this momentum of very strong antitrust reinvigoration. A lot of talk, a lot of discussion has taken place about tech companies and tech platforms, and more specifically about digital markets. We even see in the European Union that a dedicated regulation is ongoing with the Digital Markets Act, which is aimed at regulating digital market as opposed to the other markets in the economy. So there's a lot of focus on digital market and tech companies. Bill, to what extent do you think that digital market and tech market as a sector will be the primary focus on over the next 4 years? Or do you think it will be just a general focus on all sectors of the economy, as opposed to the main discussions we have for the last couple of years, where mainly it has remained about the big tech companies, and it seems that we perhaps overlooked a number of other antitrust problems in more traditional sectors of the economy. What do you think about this?
Noah reminds me that I owe you a disclaimer as well. I'm a non-executive director on the board of the UK Competition and Markets Authority, which has a keen interest in many of these issues, and I speak for myself and not the CMA. I think an answer in two parts. One is that the leading tech firms will be the focal point of attention for the coming few years. As you mentioned, Aurelien, the development of new proposals to create a collateral regulatory apparatus. The DMA in the European Union, the Digital Markets Unit in the United Kingdom, proposals for other regulatory regimes in other nations, all suggest that an important focus of attention in the next few years will be what the EU calls gatekeepers, what the UK is calling firms with a strategic market position. Those are going to be set in place within the next 18 months, and they will be the context in which new regulatory tools are tested. So in that respect, large digital platforms will be the focus of attention. But you also suggest correctly, I think, that the debate and movement of policy involves far more than simply tech. Many of the proposals for change implicate all areas of commercial activity and reach firms with significant market positions in a host of other more humble settings. So many of the concepts that are being developed and discussed with respect to tech are going to have potentially broad application in other areas. And I think a concern that one might have about the focus on tech is that in the meantime, there are other things that deserve attention. The traditional questions of collusive behavior by small and large firms alike, the development of policies and practices that involve things such as government procurement, that involve a host of other government policy making arenas in which the competitive environment is shaped. I suppose one thing that the modern debate does involve is a broader discussion and consideration of the whole constellation of public policies that create the enabling environment in which competition takes place. So for the short term, meaning the next few years, the tech firms will be the subject of attention in these new regulatory experiments. But what's at issue here is a far more basic reconsideration of competition policy in all domains.
Yeah, that's great. Noah, what do you think? Which sector will be the focus? Because there's also a discussion on hospital mergers, on a number of other traditional sectors of the economy, which, I mean, may deserve some antitrust scrutiny. Or do you think that because of the popularity, because it makes big headlines, the focus will still remain on the tech sector?
So I think the answer is a bit of both. On the one hand, first of all, my view is that all sectors, right, deserve a serious level of antitrust scrutiny. I don't think anyone is outside of this. There are certain instances where a regulation will effectively displace antitrust, but whether you're talking about pharma or hospitals or tech, I think there is going to be continued vigorous looks. For example, if you look at the record in the last 3 years, like including my tenure at FTC, of Section 2 monopolization cases, you of course have two very prominent monopolization cases involving big tech companies, the DOJ's case against Google, the FTC's case against Facebook. But more of them are in the what I will broadly call the healthcare space, pharmaceuticals, biotech, this kind of thing. So there are other industries that are also undergoing continued scrutiny. I also think it is important to note, if you look, for example, at the House report, that while the political case and the policy case is being made for reform around the tech companies, right? The House report focuses on 4 of the 5 largest tech companies, not all of the largest tech companies, but 4 of the 5 by market cap. The prescriptions, right, the proposals in terms of the case law to be undone, presumptions to be put in with mergers, go much more broadly. We don't know what will be adopted or what won't be adopted. Tech will continue to be a focus. I think healthcare will continue to be a focus. Certainly hospitals will continue to be a focus, but certainly the ambition of the project, whether it is at the agencies where, like, including the one at which I sit already, or the legislative proposals, all of these go broader than just big tech. We are not just talking about big tech, although those companies, or at least some of those companies, are definitely the main points of the global conversation.
Yeah,
I should just add, sorry. I should just add, Bill is absolutely right to note some of the legislative and other regulatory goings on in Europe, as well as in the UK, which now we have to say is not in Europe in the same sense that it was. You also see here, right, thoughts about how to approach some of these problems. Congress has been considering privacy legislation, and there are those who view competition law as adequate to resolve privacy issues or essential to resolve privacy issues. My own view is that competition and privacy sometimes line up, often don't. And if it's privacy you want to deal with, a privacy regime may be what you need.
Well, William will tell you that the privacy law of the US is GDPR, right? Is a default rule for what do you think, William, of these privacy issues and privacy reform? Because de facto there is an application of GDPR in the US, and the question is, if we want to regulate and change these privacy rules, to what extent it will create an additional layer at the top of GDPR, or it will create also regulatory divergence and discrepancies between Europe and US. I mean, there's a lot of stakes here in terms of regulatory convergence, or at least the attempt to make regulations more converging, and you're very well placed between the UK and the US to see that issue. What do you think about these legislative efforts that may also fragment, if you want, the transatlantic space and the way a company operates in that space?
I think if we ask, does the United States have an overarching privacy policy, a glib and somewhat sarcastic answer is we do. It's called the GDPR, and it's called the state of California. And those give us a national privacy program. if you step back for a moment, though, and ask, in designing a national approach to privacy, do you want Brussels and Sacramento to be setting the foundation for principles that will apply throughout your own economy? And is that the right approach to engage in the international discussion about what standards should be? I suspect that in the coming 2 years, the Congress will overcome basic questions about preemption and private rights of action to establish a truly national privacy regulatory scheme. But in some ways, the United States is coming to this process very late. A great deal of concrete has already been poured, and it's not going to be unseated by what the U.S. does. And if you look at Noah, raised the intersection of the concerns of privacy, perhaps consumer protection and competition law. We have several international streams of policymaking now that implicate all of these. On the competition privacy side, it's again the DMA, the DMU. These are proceeding full speed ahead. And the larger international discussion about what the intersection of these domains is, how policymaking in one area will affect the achievement of goals in the other, both inside jurisdictions and across jurisdictions, is not happening in a very significant way. And a dilemma, I think, for U.S. policymakers is, for the Congress, for others, is lots of the international standards are being set now, whether or not we participate in that process through the adoption of our own regulatory mechanism. And that is, in a sense, for the United States, the rules are being set abroad. And again, in California, and as a national policymaking matter, we're not engaged in that.
That's very, very true. Just to keep on discussion on the legislative reform and what's going on, of course, in Capitol Hill, there is all this discussion of if you want to change antitrust enforcement, there might not be a need for a change of antitrust laws in themselves. You just referred to Barry Lynn. Barry Lynn has been was part of the hearing last Friday, where he made clear that there was no need to change antitrust laws if you want to change the antitrust enforcement. So how do we justify these change of laws if the change of antitrust enforcement we may want, or some may claim, is possible through, let's say, soft law instrument, through change of the case precedents, or also just a change of approach from the FTC and the DOJ. Is there a real need to change antitrust laws as they are, or are we more talking about enforcement change?
I think it's important to take note, as Noah was saying before, that there are currently a number of significant matters in the courts now, matters that have been generated by the public enforcement agencies. When I look at the FTC's docket, I see the case against Facebook, the Qualcomm case still going on, but other matters that don't receive so much attention, such as SureScripts, 1-800-CONTACTS. The FTC has a pretty ambitious mix right now of larger cases, but also smaller cases that could make big law. And one approach to changing the framework of enforcement and changing the boundaries of enforcement is to press these and similar matters ahead to a conclusion. I think the obstacle that the advocates of legislative change point to is the fact that there is a strong disposition in our courts to be skeptical of many of these measures. In my own view, a great deal of the skepticism is rooted in judicial precedents that have viewed the U.S. system of private rights of action with great concern and have established doctrines that seek, as a matter of substance, to limit the ability of private litigants to advance cases in ways that perhaps establish liability principles and remedies that the courts think are overreaching. And adverse consequences, that has adversely affected the government's ability to prevail as well. Those doctrines have spilled over onto the government. The U.S. federal agencies, that is the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission, have not been before the Supreme Court in a Section 2, a monopolization case, in their own right as a litigant, that is not as amicus or advisor to the court, but as a litigant since 1973. That's a long time ago. That's almost a half century ago. And the fact that the government has not been before the courts more often in these cases means it has not been part of that conversation where it can say, you might not trust private litigants with class actions, but you can trust us more because we represent the public at larger public interests. I see this current collection of cases, large and smaller in some sense, as a major test of whether the government in its own right as a litigant will have more credibility in the eyes of the courts. At the same time, I look at past experience with cases from my time at the FTC, a case like Rambus, where the FTC was flung aside in many respects on the basis of doctrines that the Supreme Court designed to cabin private lawsuits. So I would be open in my own mind to adjustments in legislation that seek to remind the courts that the government in its own right as a litigant stands in a different position with a different set of interests when it attempts to prosecute the antitrust laws. But there are major litigation initiatives going on right now, many of them at the FTC, that promise to affect the boundaries of doctrine in the future.
That's great. That's very interesting, and to also raise the issue of private class actions and also the private enforcement of antitrust, which may not fulfill all the objectives that a public interest action can have. Noah, what is your stake on the ongoing legislative reform? What's going on, and this need of changing antitrust laws? Do we need to change antitrust laws in order to change antitrust enforcement? Right.
So a couple of points. I'd start with, I think Bill is right in the main about the arc of the courts, about the skepticism they bring to some of these cases, and to some extent, why they bring this skepticism. I do think US courts are faced with a bevy. This is not specific to antitrust, securities, derivative, tort, you name it. They to some extent, worry about private suits, and maybe that worry is exacerbated where you've got treble damages, as you do in antitrust. I would note there are a couple of decisions recently at the Supreme Court, the appellate courts, that go the other way on private plaintiffs specifically. So you could look at Apple versus Pepper. You could look at Geldwen. Different kinds of cases, but both actually trending more in favor of private plaintiffs. So it will be interesting to see how that trend moves going forward. I think that whether you change laws depends, or whether you should change laws depends to a large extent on what it is you want to achieve. And sometimes this conversation is had at a level of generality, reigning in the tech companies, that isn't particularly helpful. The focus on gatekeepers is one thing. The focus on privacy is another. The focus on mergers is another still. You have, and the list goes on, you have a bunch of different areas where people are thinking about whether problems exist and how to solve them. And that is really one major issue. With respect to the enforcement question, enforcement is up. The FTC, for example, in the last year, I think, has brought more cases than it has since 2001, more merger challenges. We've got a boatload of, or a relative boatload of Section 2 cases. I believe the DOJ hadn't brought a Section 2 case before Google in something like 20 years. So there's a bunch of Section 2 cases. There are a bunch of merger cases. The members of the commission don't agree on every case, but I don't think you can argue that enforcement isn't up. I think that is a thing that is real. It has begun, and in the main, it will continue.
Right. Yeah. So there's some leeway for enforcement to change, also according to the guidelines and principles. Well, there's this, of course, this bill that has been introduced by Senator Amy Klobuchar, and there's a number of provisions on these bills which talk about the unlawful acquisitions or exclusionary conduct. There's perhaps one element that is the most consensual aspect, and I would like you to react on, is the increase of FTC resources. So there's this need or perceived view that the FTC has been under-resourced for too long and to a too large extent. What do you think, Noah, as of course, as an FTC commissioner and who's working in the FTC on a daily basis?
Look, in two recent legislative efforts, we have gotten some more money, and that money is very helpful. I think we could use more money still. I do think that some of this is less about what the courts are doing and what the statutes say, and just the ability to sort of cover the field. The agencies could do more with more. I think that goes without saying. And I think there are deals where we might have to pass, and there are hard decisions that we have to make with the resources that we have today.
Yeah, William, do you want to react on the proposal of the increase of FTC resources? I mean, you are a non-executive director of the UK's Competition and Market Authority, so you have this view from the UK, but also you've been a former FTC chairman. So, what is your perception on the need now in 2021 to increase the FTC resources, because it hasn't been fully increased for many years? Do you think it will help investigation of case, fact finding, all these elements which are not very easy those days?
And I'm delighted that one consequence of the modern debate is that we are focusing more attention not simply on the question of what agencies should do in substance, but how they do it. The neglected questions of implementation are starting to receive the attention they deserve, and one of them is resources. When I take for not simply the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice, but when I look at competition authorities around the world, there's an epidemic failure to match commitments with the means necessary to carry out the task in question. This is a bit of delusion that all of our countries engage in. We have the highest aspirations, the boldest goals, but when it comes to paying for it, we don't want to do that. We want to drive and take off the lot a state-of-the-art Mercedes sedan, but we want to pay for a fully depreciated Chevrolet. And we're puzzled that we can't get the Mercedes in terms of the quality of policy outputs. That's a chronic problem in our societies. In terms of antitrust enforcement, I think a dramatic upgrade is important, but in two ways. One, the net amount of resources has to be increased in order to perform existing functions capably. It's not simply competition. If you benchmark the FTC's resources devoted to data protection privacy and compare it to the FTC's peers abroad, the larger data protection agencies, we have a decidedly inadequate allocation. That's not the FTC's doing. Those are legislative choices, but the FTC complement to be a truly full-fledged national data protection regulator for privacy would have to be double to 3 times what the agency has right now as a start. So in the aggregate, more resources will enable the agency to carry out its mandate in a more capable way. But I think it's more the matter of just getting more people. I'm concerned with the compensation side of the fence too. I am very concerned about the ability of agencies around the world, the one I work with now in the UK, but also my former home at the FTC, but I could say the same for the Department of Justice, is the essence of success in so many matters is your ability to maintain continuity of staff at a high level with high quality. You need to run big cases, major projects, people who've done it before. I want someone with 10, 15 years of experience in running those kinds of matters. And when I've looked agency by agency, agencies that have that capacity have a greater likelihood of success in running big projects. You can't do that with a compensation scale now. I mean, I would pay our civil servants much more in these areas, but as a start, I would look at what we have done in the United States with financial services, with the Consumer Financial Protection Board. When Congress created that mechanism a decade ago, it decided it was important enough to put it on the higher salary scale that employees at the financial services regulators get, which is fully 20% above the scale that we pay attorneys and economists now at the FTC and the Department of Justice. A 20% boost, for example, at the FTC would greatly increase the FTC's capacity to keep the people it needs to run complex projects. Also, you could think about debt forgiveness, where if you come to the FTC, you sign a contract to stay for a given period of time, we wipe out that heavy anchor of debt that you incurred as an undergraduate and in graduate school to go and do the work. If you liberate people from those kinds of burdens, they'll stay longer. And the staying longer with your good people dramatically improves performance. I would put the proposition this strongly. If we're not willing to address the compensation question, above and beyond the matter of simply increasing aggregate resources, I would take a lot of the resources to pay a smaller number of people a higher wage in order to keep the capability. In short, if you ask me, as you might in sport or in music, how good is the team? Tell me who's playing, especially when you keep in mind the awesome resources that defendants in these high profile, high stakes cases are going to bring to bear on the commission and on the Department of Justice. I would say, as Americans, if we want good results, as in so many other areas of life, we're going to have to pay for it. And it's not just in aggregate resources. We're going to have to think about what it takes to keep skilled professionals on the job doing these kinds of cases. I realize as a nation, we hate to face that kind of challenge. If we're not going to do it, then we better become accustomed to driving a used Chevrolet.
Yeah, that's great. Fascinating insight. Thank you very much. Noah, do you want to? Yep.
Sure. I think I'd speak to 2 points that Bill just made. I want to resist a little the metaphor of the broken down Chevrolet, and I'll pick on the data protection point in particular. It is true that we have a small fraction of the lawyers working on data protection at FTC that our counterparts in the UK or in Ireland or in any number of countries in Europe have. However, the effects of their work, the nature of enforcement, the level of injunctive relief that we command, the level of fines that we secure, the number of cases we bring against the number of defendants, others pale in comparison. So even without a law, and even without the money, and even without the people, I think the people at the FTC do not only a terrific job, they do a job that really is the envy of the data protection world. Europe excels at adopting new laws, but taking the laws we have today, laws from 1915, COPPA, which is substantially more recent than that, I think we have built a data protection enforcement regime that is having a greater effect than any other on earth. That said, people matter. While I am not the first person to ask for a raise, I will for my people. Bill is absolutely right. I don't see a good reason why having to match securities lawyers or having to match accountants at the PCAOB, my fun fact about the federal government is that the highest paid person in the federal government is not the president of the United States, but the head of the PCAOB, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, or consumer protection for financials at CFPB. It is not clear it is not clear to me why our folks don't get paid on the same scale that they do. I think we deal with issues that are important as well, and we certainly face the same kind of sophistication on the other side. Where the rubber meets the road on funding often has to do with hiring economists as outside experts, this sort of thing. But I think all of those things would help.
That's one word on we can't escape that topic of the creation of a post of antitrust and competition policy within the White House. This is quite new, right? In terms of the nomination, but also the strategy. Definitely, Biden and the Biden administration has a very key and very key aspect of antitrust policy, and it wants to foster antitrust. But what can we expect from a position in the White House as opposed to the coordination efforts that already take place between the FTC and the antitrust division? What do you predict or expect from that nomination, Noah?
Well, I think Professor Wu is already in. He doesn't have to go through Senate confirmation for the appointment that has been made. My understanding, at least, is that he's already in. I don't know exactly what to expect. I think that based on what the administration has laid out as its priorities, and based on the great amount that Professor Wu has written, I think he will be a thought leader. I think he will encourage more aggressive antitrust enforcement. I suspect he will advocate for legislative changes. I'm not sure about any of those things, but that would be my guess. There are aspects in terms of the coordination of agencies that need a little help. I will throw out the Senate hearing about a year and a half ago about clearance between the two agencies. That is a process that could be rationalized. You don't want to have, in the bad sense that this can mean, political interference in antitrust. This was something the Nixon administration got in trouble for. But in terms of a greater focus, in terms, I hope, of looking at some of the federal authorities and regulatory regimes that inhibit competition, looking at those, kicking the tires, seeing maybe whether they're not working, I think that could be really helpful.
Yeah, great. William, what is your stance on this nomination? Is there a risk, as Noah just said, is there a risk of political interference, or are you more comfortable with that nomination?
I'm comfortable with it. I mean, if we ask, is there globally, is there a dimension of political economy, politics in competition law? I think it's a bit like asking if there's oxygen in the air. Yes, it surrounds us. How could a policy domain so important not have a connection to the political process, if only for purposes of accountability? So it does. I think Tim's an enormously capable person. I think that the positive possibility here is that he uses the opportunity to create the kinds of policy synapses that Noah was just referring to. He becomes an effective voice inside a circle of decision makers that represent a host of different and often conflicting interests within the span of government, and that he can be a voice for bringing competition policy issues to the fore, reminding people that competition is a very useful tool to promote economic progress and to achieve, as a byproduct, a host of other desirable, attractive social and political ends. That depends a lot on Tim. Does this become a one-off, or by reason of his intellectual gifts, his knowledge, and his personal sensibilities, is he able to make this a vibrant part of policymaking so that when Tim leaves, there is another person who takes on this job and steps in? On a good day, the answer to those questions would be yes. A more doubting and less happy possibility is that he's there for a couple of years, he leaves, and we're back to business as usual. Or you can appoint someone and nobody pays attention. There's a possibility to have a great impact or not so much of an impact. I suspect because of who Tim is, I'd be more inclined to think there will be an impact. But the agenda of, I'd say the hardest thing for him is to decide what are going to be my top three priorities. Noah gave you a list of things he could do. What are the three things, not the 30 things, but the three things I'm going to spend my time on and regard as the most important things to do?
Right. That's very useful. For the last question, I mean, we're already over our time. It's just we could spend hours talking about these very exciting moments for antitrust we're in. As a last question, just an exercise of prediction, how would you see antitrust in the next 4 years? With everything that we just discussed, how do you predict the state of antitrust in the US in the next 4 years, meaning at the end of the Biden's term? Noah, do you want to give your prediction?
So I think that the aggressiveness that's going on in court right now will increase. I think you'll see more litigation. What effects that will have, I'm not sure, right? That can result in more antitrust, if you will, but it can also result in losses and legal rules that don't favor the agencies. So, but I do think you'll see more litigation. One thing I think you will also see is an increasing attempt to slow M&A generally that isn't necessarily as strictly related to competition concerns as historically folks might have agreed upon. So, for example, last summer, there were a number of members of Congress who called for and introduced legislation to effect a broad ban of all M&A activity. And that isn't just mergers, right? This includes equity purchases that meet the Hart-Scott-Rodino threshold. That didn't come into place, but it was made by some pretty prominent people. More recently, the acting chair of the agency announced the end of early termination, where companies that believe they don't present any issue competitively can come to the agency and say, hey, can you just let my deal go through? With one exception of which I'm aware, we're not doing that right now. We did allow, as of Friday, some more exceptions where the agencies have issued second requests and resolved whatever concerns they had. But interfering with market operations for transactions where no one has a competitive concern is a novelty. And I do think it speaks to a broader skepticism of M&A markets than we have seen before. The other thing that I predict, because my colleagues have spoken about it publicly, is I think you will see attempts to make competition rules under FTC's current authority. I am skeptical about that authority in the first place, but I do think the attempt will be made. What rules we get, whether they withstand court scrutiny, I think is another question.
That rule making process and all these discussions that is taking place. Very, very interesting. William, what are your bets and predictions for the next 4 years of the state of antitrust in the US?
Yeah, I have some predictions. I'll back them all up with the price of a single espresso drink at the coffee shop of your choice. And I like Noah's categories here. On litigation, the new leadership in many ways is committed to doing much more. And in an exaggerated way, they have denigrated the significance of what's already on the way. They're going to discover in a hurry how hard it is to bring the matters that are in flight already to a successful landing. They'll discover how ambitious that agenda is, and they'll have to spend time bringing those things home. But because they have made such a point of saying that past enforcement was desperately inadequate and that cases like Facebook and Google are just a good start, there will be inevitable and irresistible pressure to do more. So I think both the Department of Justice and the FTC will launch new major Section 2 cases. Who knows who the targets will be, but they'll have to do it. They're going to have to add new matters on both the merger and non-merger categories to the existing enforcement agenda. A big question, can they run all those cases effectively with what they have? Second, I think Noah's absolutely right. There is inexorable pressure now to use existing FTC authority, to use rulemaking to promulgate new principles of competition policy. Maybe the target for that will be non-compete clauses, but I think it is impossible for the new leadership of the FTC not to bring a new trade regulation rule and to try that. They've staked a lot of their reputational capital on that. A last issue I'll raise is I think we're going to have a basic debate about the future framework of antitrust enforcement. There are going to be several events that bring the authority of the FTC into view. The current AMG Capital case that deals with disgorgement, new debates about the authority of the FTC to get other remedies. If you bring a rulemaking case, it's going to ultimately bring the question of the soundness of the FTC's authority to do competition rulemaking into focus. If we do have new privacy legislation, who becomes the privacy regulator? I think we're going to have a basic decision during the Biden administration about whether we keep 2 national agencies in the competition field. Does the FTC become the new data protection authority? Does it become a super authority with both data protection, consumer, and competition as it has now? And what is the framework of authority and power spread across our national agencies? In short, we're going to face and have a debate and reconsideration of the framework through which we implement policy.
That's great. I mean, I have now to thank you because we're going over our time. That was a very exciting discussion. I want to really thank you for your great insight because of your experience and of course your position on the state of antitrust, what's going on. We talk about the political environment. We talk about the enforcement action guidelines and priorities. We talk about this institutional framework. All these aspects, of course, we're going to talk about it for many months and many years to come. And I think we've tried to decipher the complexities of the Biden administration as it starts now very clearly. I just want to thank you warmly, and also to help me kick off this dynamic antitrust conversation, Sari. I mean, that's you're the first two experts, and I really want to thank you for that. So next session, it will be on the March 26th, and we will have Richard Gilbert to discuss his book, which he just published last year, Innovation Matters, Competition Policy for the High-Tech Economy. And you have the link just down the YouTube page. So thank you, William. Thank you, Noah. And I'll hope to see you for the next events, and I will hope to see the viewers also to be with us on the March 26th. Thank you.